It's clear that corporations consider themselves creative and want us to also consider them creative. But what do they mean when they call themselves creative? Is it the same thing we think creativity means? What we mean when we call an individual creative? For that matter, what do we mean when we call an individual creative? For answers, we might look at the abundance of self-help books on the topic. Many of these books, unsurprisingly, focus on creativity as just creating, bringing something into being, making it from nothing, doing something without precedent. But the language they use here is telling. From nothing, without precedent. They speak of the inherent novelty of creative action and thus conclude that it must be independent of experience or outside influence. Creativity is claimed to come from within. They speak of it as a mental process, as a psychological state, even as a spiritual experience. And what corporations point to in themselves and call creativity doesn't seem to fit that bill. Whereas individual creativity is focused on novelty, with value as an afterthought, corporate creativity cares more about the value of the output. Novelty is risky, and risks might not bring in money. This creates a preference for building on existing work, rather than creating something entirely untested. Corporations are thus much more results-driven, because they're constrained by the need to sell a product, and this shapes their view of what creativity is, even when their proclamations of creativity start being less about the products and more about the corporation's own identity. But there is still novelty there. So if creativity is novelty plus value, then even if the mix is different, this is creative action. But does doing creative things make the corporation a creative entity? How can an entity with no mind of its own engage in what has been framed as a mental activity? Now, as we've seen from the first presentation, corporations are very good at calling themselves creative. But that's just their efforts to create a perception of themselves as creative. Just because something is marketed as creative and seen as such doesn't necessarily mean it actually is creative. So maybe a lack of a mind does disqualify corporations from being creative. Maybe the corporate person isn't actually creative. It only has perceived or imagined creativity, with the real thing absent. But then what exactly is real creativity? And who gets to define it? If we say that corporations cannot be truly creative because they don't have a mind on the basis that self-help books claim that a mind is a prerequisite, then we're implicitly claiming that those books have the authority to decree what does and doesn't constitute creativity. Parallels can be drawn here to power. From a sociological perspective, power is a matter of how much influence one has over how many people. But more importantly, it's about social perceptions. If someone is imagined to have power and treated as powerful, then that is real social power. The same idea can be applied to creativity. If corporations are imagined by society as being creative, then they are creative. The only way to separate the social construction of creativity from real creativity is to claim that some individual or group gets to unilaterally define what creativity is. In other words, the corporate form of creativity is real creativity because people in general agree that it is creativity. But in a way, this social construction of creativity is inherently biased towards corporations. Since a corporation is a conglomeration of many people, it has far more clout than an individual. Rather than being limited to a single person's resources, both monetary and social, corporations can use their comparatively immense societal power to essentially define their own version of creativity. This allows them to apply the label creative to themselves and reap the benefits of that image, even though those benefits come from other standards of creativity that the corporations might not meet. Corporations strive to be perceived as real people by claiming what is seen as a defining trait of humanity. Ad campaigns no longer sell products, but rather try to sell the company itself as creative. But corporations make these creative identities by exercising their power to set their own standards for creativity. This new corporate creativity is not about products anymore. Even soap companies claim to be creative now, but about productivity. Creativity is now measured in productivity, and productivity is of course measured in profit. But corporations are the ones setting the bar here, and with the huge resources at their disposal, that bar is set far too high to be attainable to individuals. Yet, all the same, individuals have started to adopt their own version of corporate creativity. It's becoming less a matter of what individuals produce and more about marketing themselves as creative so that everything they do is perceived as creative action. Is trying to match this new corporate standard of creativity a choice or a requirement for individuals? Either way, these changing and conflicting definitions of creativity have formed a sort of cycle, where corporations try to be more like individuals by painting themselves as creative, while individuals become more like corporations by engaging in this new corporate kind of creativity. But if both individuals and corporations are engaging in this ever-changing dance of value and novelty that forms creativity, what then separates corporations from people? All that remains to differentiate actual human beings from the legal persons that corporations are seems to be our physical bodies and our own individual minds. But then what exactly is the mind, this final frontier? Perhaps that's a question for another day.